All these, ooh, all these little buttons seem to be working. How about that? So, welcome to the second night of Old Christmas by Washington Irving. Now, Old Christmas, remember, this was published in 1820, which a generation later they would call the good old days. This is January of 1820, George III, King of England. Remember him? Died. George IV is now moved up from regent to king. And we all think of Victorian Christmas. Well, guess what? Queen Victoria is 1 year old at this point. So Old Christmas is a little farther back. So there's one character who was a young officer at the Battle of Waterloo. This dates back, folks. And Irving is talking about customs that date so far back they're pre-Christian, as you'll find out in a few minutes. So, Old Christmas from the sketchbook, published 1820. Christmas Day. When I awoke the next morning, it seemed as if all the events of the previous evening had been a dream, and nothing but the identity of the ancient chamber convinced me of their reality. While I lay musing on my pillow, I heard the sound of little feet pattering outside the door and a whispering consultation. Presently, a choir of small voices chanted forth an old Christmas carol, the burden of which was, "Rejoice, our Savior, he was born on Christmas Day in the morning." I rose softly, slipped on my clothes, opened the door suddenly, and beheld one of the most beautiful little fairy groups that a painter could imagine. It consisted of a boy and two girls, the eldest not more than 6, lovely as seraphs. They were going the round of the house and singing at every chamber door, but my sudden appearance frightened them into mute bashfulness. They remained for a moment until, as if by one impulse, they scampered away. And as they turned an angle in the gallery, I heard them laughing in triumph at their escape. Everything inspired to produce a kind and happy feelings in this household of old-fashioned hospitality. The window of my chamber looked out upon what in summer would have been a beautiful landscape. There was a sloping lawn, a fine stream winding at the foot of it, an attractive park beyond, with noble clumps of trees and herds of deer. At a distance was a neat hamlet, with the smoke from the cottage chimneys hanging over it, and a church with its dark spire in strong relief against the clear, cold sky. The house was surrounded with evergreens, according to the English custom, and which would have given almost an appearance of summer, but the morning was extremely frosty. The light vapor of the preceding evening had been precipitated by the cold and covering every blade of grass and tree with its fine crystallizations. The rays of a dazzling bright morning sun had a dazzling effect upon the glittering foliage. A robin, perched upon the top of a mountain ash that hung its clusters of red berries just before my window, was basking himself in the sunshine and piping a few querulous notes. And a peacock was displaying all the glories of his train and strutting with the pride and gravity of a Spanish grandee on the terrace walk below. I'd scarcely finished dressing myself when a servant invited me to family prayers. He showed me the way to a small chapel in the old wing of the house, where I found the principal part of the family already assembled in a kind of gallery, furnished with cushions, hassocks, and large prayer books. And the servants were seated on benches below. The old gentleman read prayers from a desk in front of the gallery, and Master Simon acted as clerk and made the responses. I must do him the justice to say that he acquitted himself with great gravity and decorum. The service was followed by a Christmas carol, which Squire Bracebridge himself had constructed from a poem by his favorite author, Robert Herrick. And it had been adapted to an old church melody by Master Simon. As there were several good voices among the household, the effect was extremely pleasing. But I was particularly gratified by the exaltation of heart and sudden sally of grateful feeling with which the worthy squire delivered one stanza, his eyes glistening and his voice rambling out of all the bounds of time and tune. It is thou that crownest my glittering heart with guiltless mirth, and givest me wassail bowls to drink, spice to the brink. Lord, 'tis thy plenty dropping hand that soils my land, and givest me for my bushel sown twice 10 for one. I afterwards understood that early morning service was read on every Sunday and Saint's Day throughout the year, either by Mr. Bracebridge, or some member of the family. It was once almost universally the case at the seats of the nobility and gentry of England, and it is much to be regretted that the custom has fallen into neglect. Our breakfast consisted of what the squire denominated true old English fare. He indulged in some bitter lamentations over modern breakfasts of tea and toast, which he censored as being the causes of modern effeminacy and weak nerves, and the decline of old English heartiness. And though he admitted them to his table to suit the palates of his guests, yet there was a brave display of cold meats, wine, and ale on the sideboard. After breakfast, I walked about the grounds with Frank Bracebridge and Master Simon, or Mr. Simon, as he was called by everybody but the squire. We were escorted by a number of gentleman-like dogs that seemed loungers about the establishment, from the frisking spaniel to the steady old staghound, the last of which was of a race that had been in the family time out of mind. The mansion had a still more venerable look in the yellow sunshine than by the pale moonlight, and I could not but feel the force of the squire's idea that the formal terraces, heavily molded balustrades, and clipped yew trees carried with them an air of proud aristocracy. There appeared to be an unusual number of peacocks about the place, and I was making some remarks upon what I termed a flock of them that were basking under a sunny wall, when I was gently corrected in my phrasing by Master Simon, who told me that, according to the most ancient and approved treatise on hunting, I must say a muster of peacocks. In the same way, he added with a slight air of pedantry, we say a flight of doves or swallows, a bevy of quails, a herd of deer, of wrens or cranes, a skulk of foxes, or a building of rooks. Well, I could not help but smile at this display of small erudition on so whimsical a subject. But I found that the peacocks were birds of some consequence at the hall, for Frank Bracebridge informed me that they were great favorites with his father, who was extremely careful to keep up the breed, partly because they belonged to chivalry and were in great request at the stately banquets in older times, and partly because they had a pomp and magnificence about them, highly becoming to an old family mansion. Squire Master Simon now had to hurry off, having an appointment at the parish church with the village choristers who were to perform some music of his selection. There was something extremely agreeable in the cheerful flow of spirits of the little man. And I confess I had been somewhat surprised at his apt quotations from authors who were certainly not in the range of everyday reading. I mentioned this last circumstance to Frank Bracebridge, who told me with a smile that Master Simon's whole stock of erudition was confined to some half a dozen old authors, which the squire had put into his hands and which he read over and over when he had a studious fit, as he sometimes had on a rainy day or a long winter evening. And like all men who know but a few books, he looked up to them with a kind of idolatry and quoted them on all occasions. As to his songs, they were chiefly picked out of old books in the squire's library and adapted to tunes that were popular among the choice spirits of the last century. His practical applications of scraps of literature, however, had caused him to be looked upon as a prodigy of book knowledge by all the grooms, huntsmen, and small sportsmen of the neighborhood. While we were talking, we heard the distant toll of the village bell, and I was told that the squire was a little particular in having his household at church on a Christmas morning, considering it a day of pouring out of thanks and rejoicing. For, as old Tusser observed, at Christmas be merry and thankful with all, and feast thy poor neighbors, the great and the small. If you are disposed to go to church, said Frank Bracebridge, I can promise you a specimen of my cousin Simon's musical achievements. As the church is destitute of an organ, he has formed a band from the village amateurs and has established a musical club for their improvement. And he has also sorted a choir. As the morning, though frosty, was remarkably fine and clear, most of the family walked to the church, which is a very old building of gray stone and stood near a village about half a mile from the park gate. I had expected to see a sleek, well-conditioned pastor, as is often found in a snug living in the vicinity of a rich patron's table, but I was disappointed. The parson was a little, meager, black-looking man with a grizzled wig that was too wide and stood out from each ear, so that his head seemed to have shrunk away from it, like a dried filbert in its shell. He wore a rusty coat with great skirts and pockets that would have held the church Bible and prayer book. And his small legs seemed still smaller from being planted in large shoes decorated with enormous buckles. I was informed by Frank Bracebridge that the parson had been a chum of his father's at Oxford and had received this living shortly after the latter had come into the estate. He was a completely black letter, old type hunter and could scarcely read a work printed in modern Roman character or modern script. The editions of Caxton and Winckender Woad were his delight, and he was indefatigable in his researches after such old English authors as have fallen into oblivion from their worthlessness. In deference, perhaps, to the notions of the squire, he had made diligent investigations into the festive rites and holiday customs of former times, and had been as zealous in the inquiry as if he had been a boon companion. But it was merely with that plodding spirit with which men of adust temperament follow up any track of study, merely because it denominated learning, indifferent to its intrinsic nature, whether it be the illustration of the wisdom or of the ribaldry or the obscenity of antiquity. It pored over these old volumes so intensely that they seemed to have been reflected into his countenance, which indeed, if the face be an index of the mind, it might be compared to a title page of black letter. On reaching the church porch, we found the parson rebuking the gray-headed sexton for having used mistletoe among the greens with which the church was decorated. It was, he observed, an unholy plant, profaned by being used by the Druids in their mystic ceremonies. And though it might be innocently employed in the festive ornaments of halls and kitchens, yet it had been deemed by the fathers of the church as unhallowed and totally unfit for sacred purposes. So tenacious was he on this point that the poor parson was obliged to strip out a great part of the humble trophies of his taste before the parson would consent to enter upon the service of the day. The interior of the church was venerable but simple. On the walls were several mural monuments of the Bracebridges, and just beside the altar was a tomb of ancient workmanship, on which lay the effigy of a warrior in armor with his legs crossed, a sign of his having been a crusader. I was told it was one of the family who had signalized himself in the Holy Land, and the same whose picture in armor hung in the Great Hall. During service, Master Simon stood up in the pew and repeated the responses very audibly, evincing that kind of ceremonious decorum punctually observed by a gentleman of the old school and a man of old family connections. I observed, too, that he turned over the leaves of a folio prayer book with something of a flourish, possibly to show off an enormous seal ring, which enriched one of his fingers, and which had the look of a family relic. But he was evidently most concerned about the musical part of the service, keeping his eye fixed intently upon the choir and beating time with much gesticulation and emphasis. The orchestra was in a small gallery, which presented a most whimsical grouping of heads, and piled on top of one another, which I particularly noticed among them the face of the village tailor, pale fellow, with retreating forehead and chin, who played upon the clarionet and seems to have blown his face into a point. And there was another, the short, pursy man, stooping and laboring over a bass viol so as to show nothing but the top of a round, bald head, like the egg of an ostrich. There were 2 or 3 pretty faces among the female singers, to which the keen air of a frosty morning had given a bright rosy tint. But the gentlemen choristers had evidently been chosen, like old fiddles, more for tone than looks. As several had to sing from the same book, there were clusterings of very odd physiognomies, not unlike the groups of cherubs we sometimes see on country tombstones. The usual services of the choir were managed tolerably well, the vocal parts generally lagging a little behind the instrumental, and some loitering fiddler now and then making up for lost time by traveling over a passage with prodigious dexterity and clearing some more bars than the keenest fox hunter could be in at the end. But the great trial was an anthem that had been prepared by Master Simon, and on which he had founded great expectation. Unfortunately, there was a blunder at the very outset. The musicians became flurried. Master Simon was in a fever. Everyone went on lamely and irregularly until they came to a chorus beginning with, "Now let us sing with one accord," which seemed to be a signal for parting company, for all became discord and confusion. Each shifted for himself, then got to the end, or rather as soon as he could. The parson gave us a most erudite sermon on the rites and ceremonies of Christmas, and the propriety of observing it not merely as a day of thanksgiving, but of rejoicing, supporting the correctness of his opinions by the earliest uses of the church, and enforcing them by the authorities of Theophilus of Caesarea, St. Cyprian, St. Christopherham, St. Augustine, and a cloud more of saints and fathers from whom he made copious quotations. I was a little at a loss to perceive the necessity of such a mighty array of forces to maintain a point which no one present seemed inclined to dispute. But I soon found the good man had a legion of ideal adversaries to contend with, having in the course of his researches on the subject of Christmas got completely embroiled with the sectarian controversies of the Puritan Revolution. when the Puritans had made such a fierce assault upon the ceremonies of the church and poor old Christmas was driven out of the land by proclamation of Parliament. The worthy parson lived but of times past and knew but a little of the present. He kindled into warmth with the ardor of his contest and the host of imaginary foes with he had to combat. Had a stubborn conflict with old Prynne or 2 or 3 other forgotten champions of the Roundheads on the subject of Christmas festivity, and concluded by urging his hearers in the most solemn and affecting manner to stand with the traditionary systems and customs of their fathers and feast and make merry upon this joyful anniversary of the church. I have seldom known a sermon attended apparently with more immediate effects, for on leaving the church, the congregation seemed one and all possessed with the gaiety of spirit so earnestly enjoined by their pastor. The older folks gathered in knots in the churchyard, greeting each other and shaking hands. The villagers doffed their hats to the squire as he passed, giving him the good wishes of the season with every appearance of heartfelt sincerity, and were invited by him to the hall to take something to keep out the cold of the weather. And I heard blessings uttered by several of the poor, which convinced me that, in the midst of his enjoyments, the worthy old cavalier had not forgotten the true Christmas virtue of charity. On our way homeward, his heart seemed overflowing with generous and happy feelings. As we passed over a rising ground which commanded something of a prospect, the sound of rustic merriment now and then reached our ears. The squire paused for a few moments and looked around with an air of inexpressible happiness. The beauty of the day was itself sufficient to inspire philanthropy. Notwithstanding the frostiness of the morning, the sun in his cloudless journey had acquired sufficient power to melt away the thin covering snow from every southern incline, and to bring about the living green which adorns the English landscape even in midwinter. There was something truly cheering in this triumph of warmth and greenery over the frosty thraldom of winter. It was, as the squire observed, an emblem of Christmas hospitality, breaking through the chills of ceremony and selfishness, and thawing every heart into a flow. He pointed with pleasure to the indications of good cheer reeking from the chimneys of the comfortable farmhouses and low thatched cottages. I love, said he, to see this time well kept by rich and poor. It is a great thing to have one day of the year, at least, when you are sure of being welcome wherever you go, and having, as it were, the world all thrown open to you. The squire went on to lament the deplorable decay of the games and amusements that were once prevalent at this season among the lower orders and countenanced by the higher, where the old castles and manor houses were thrown open at daylight, when the tables were covered with brawn and beef and humming ale, when the harp and the carol resounded all day long, and the rich and poor were alike welcome to enter and make merry. Our old games and local customs, said he, had a great effect in making the peasant fond of his home, and the promotion of them by the gentry made him feel fond of his lord. They made the times merrier and kinder and better. The nation, continued he, is altered. We have almost lost our simple, true-hearted peasantry. They've broken asunder from the higher classes and seem to think that their interests are separate. They've become too knowing and begin to read newspapers and listen to alehouse politicians and talk of reform. I think one mode of keeping them in good humor in these hard times would be for the nobility and gentry to pass more time on their estates, mingle more among the country people, and set the merry old Christmas games going again. Such was the good squire's project for mitigating public discontent. And indeed, he had once attempted to put his doctrine into practice, and a few years before had kept open house during the holidays in the old style. The country people, however, did not understand how to play their parts in the scene of hospitality. Many uncouth circumstances occurred. The manor was overrun by all the vagrants of the country, and more beggars were drawn into the neighborhood in 1 week than the parish officers could get rid of in a year. Since then, he had contented himself with inviting the decent part of the neighboring peasantry to call at the hall on Christmas Day, and distributing beef and bread and ale among the poor, that they might make merry in their own dwellings. We had not been long home when the sound of music was heard from a distance. A band of country lads without coats, their shirt sleeves fancifully tied with ribbons, their hats decorated with greens, and clubs in their hands, were seen advancing up the avenue, followed by a large number of villagers and peasantry. They stopped before the hall door, where the music struck up a peculiar air, and the lads performed a curious and intricate dance, advancing, retreating, and striking their clubs together, keeping exact time with the music, while one, whimsically crowned with a fox's head and skin, the tail of which flaunted down his back, kept capering around the skirts of the dance, rattling a Christmas box with many antic gesticulations. The squire eyed this fanciful exhibition with great interest and delight, and gave me a full account of its origin, which he traced to the times when the Romans held possession of the island, plainly proving there was a lineal descent of the sword dance of the ancients. It was now, he said, nearly extinct, but he had accidentally met with traces of it in the neighborhood and encouraged its revival. Though, to tell the truth, it was apt to be followed up by rough cudgel play and broken heads in the evening. After the dance was concluded, the whole party was entertained with brawn and beef and stout home brewed. The squire himself mingled among the rustics and was received with awkward demonstrations of deference and regard. It is true that I perceived 2 or 3 of the younger peasants, as they were raising their tankards to their mouths when the squire's back turned, making something of a grimace and giving each other the wink. But the moment they caught my eye, they pulled grave faces, were exceedingly demure. When Master Simon came about, however, they all seemed more at their ease. His varied occupations and amusements had made him well known throughout the neighborhood. He was a visitor at every farmhouse and cottage, gossiped with the farmers and their wives, and romped with their daughters. The bashfulness of the guests soon gave way before good cheer and affability. There is something genuine and affectionate in the gaiety of the lower orders when it is excited by the bounty and familiarity of those above them. The warm glow of gratitude enters into their mirth, and a kind word or a small pleasantry, frankly uttered by the patron, gladdens the heart of the dependent more than oil and wine. The whole house, indeed, seemed abandoned to merriment. As I passed my room to dress for dinner, I heard the sound of music in a small court, and looking through a window that commanded it, I perceived a band of wandering musicians with Pandean pipes and tambourine, and a pretty coquettish housemaid was dancing a jig with a smart country lad, while several of the servants were looking on. In the midst of her sport, the girl caught a glimpse of my face at the window, and coloring up, ran off with an air, of roguish, affected confusion. The Christmas dinner. I was loitering with Frank Bracebridge in the library when we heard a distant whacking sound, which he informed me was a signal for the serving up of the dinner. The squire kept up old customs in the kitchen as well as hall, and the rolling pin struck upon the dresser by the cook summoned the servants to carry in the meats. The dinner was served up in the great hall, where the squire always held his Christmas banquet. A blazing, crackling fire of logs had been heaped upon to warm the spacious apartment, and the flames went sparking and wreathing up the wide-mouthed chimney. The great picture of the Crusader and his white horse had been profusely decorated with greens for the occasion. The holly and ivy had been likewise wreathed around the helmet and weapons on the opposite wall, which I understood were the arms of the same warrior. I must own, by the by, that I had strong doubts about the authenticity of the painting and armor as having belonged to the Crusader, they certainly having the stamp of more recent days. But I was told that the painting had been considered to be of the Crusader since time out of mind, and as for the armor, it had been found in a lumber room and elevated to its present situation by the squire, who at once determined it to be the armor of the family hero. And as he was absolute authority on all such subjects in his own household, the matter had passed into current acceptation. A sideboard was set out just under the arms and armor, on which a display of plate that might have vied at least in variety with Belshazzar's parade of the vessels of the temple. Flagons, cans, cups, beakers, goblets, basins, and ears, the gorgeous utensils of good companionship that had been gradually accumulated through many generations of jovial housekeepers. Before these stood the two yule candles, beaming like two stars of the first magnitude. Other lights were distributed in its branches, and the whole array glittered like a firmament of silver. We were ushered into this banqueting scene with the sound of minstrelsy, the old harper being seated on a stool beside the fireplace and twanging his instrument with a vast deal more power than melody. Never did Christmas board display a more goodly and gracious assemblage of countenances. Those who were not handsome were at least happy. And happiness is a rare improver of your hard-favored visage. I always consider an old English family is well worth studying as a collection of Holbein's portraits of Alfred Durer's prints. There is much antiquarian lore to be acquired, much knowledge of the physiognomies of former times. Perhaps it may be from having continually before their eyes those rows of old family portraits with which the mansions of the country are stocked. Certain it is that the quaint features of antiquity are often most faithfully perpetuated in these ancient lines. And I have traced an old family nose through a whole picture gallery, legitimately handed down from generation to generation, almost from the time of the Norman conquest. Something of the kind was to be observed in the worthy company around me. Many of them, their faces had evidently been originated in a Gothic age and had been merely copied by succeeding generations. And there was, in particular, one little girl of staid demeanor with a high Roman nose and an antique vinegar aspect, who was a great favorite of the squire's, being, as he said, a Bracebridge all over, and the very counterpart of one of his ancestors who figured in the court of Henry VIII. The parson said grace, which was not a short, familiar one, such is commonly addressed to the deity in these unceremonious days, but a long, courtly, well-worded one of the ancient school. There was now a pause, as if something was expected, and suddenly the butler entered the hall with some degree of bustle. He was attended by a servant on each side with a large candle, and bore a silver dish, on which was an enormous pig's head, decorated with rosemary, with a lemon in its mouth, which was placed with great formality at the head of the table. At the moment of this pageant made its appearance, the harper struck up a flourish, at the conclusion of which the young Oxonian, upon receiving a hint from the squire, with an air of most comic gravity, gave an old carol, the first verse of which was as follows: Caput Avri defero, Redens Laudis Domino. The boar's head and hand bring I, with garlands gay and rosemary, and I pray you all to sing merrily, qui estis in convitio. Though prepared to witness many of these little eccentricities from being apprised of the peculiar hobby of mine host, yet I confess the parade with so odd a dish was somewhat complexed me, until I gathered from the conversation of the squire and the parson, it was meant to represent the bringing in of the boar's head, a dish formerly served up with great ceremony and the sound of minstrelsy and song at great tables on Christmas Day. I like the old custom, said the squire, not merely because it is stately and pleasing in itself, but because it was observed at the College of Oxford, at which I was educated. When I hear the old song chanted, it brings to mind the time when I was young and gamesome, and the noble old college hall, and my fellow students loitering about in their black gowns, many of whom, poor lads, are now in their graves. The parson, however, whose mind was not haunted by such associations, and was always taken up more with the text than the sentiment, objected to the Oxonian's version of the carol, which he affirmed was different from that sung at the college. He went on, with the dry perseverance of a commentator, to give the college reading, accompanied by sundry annotations, addressing himself at first to the company at large, but finding their attention gradually diverted to other talk and other objects, he lowered his tone as his number of listeners diminished, and he concluded his remarks in an under voice to a fat-headed old gentleman next to him, who was silently engaged in the discussion of a huge plateful of turkey. The table was literally loaded with good cheer and presented an epitome of country abundance in this season of overflowing larders. A distinguished post had been allotted to ancient sirloin, as my host termed it, being, as he added, the standard of old English hospitality, and a joint of goodly presence and full of expectation. There were several dishes quaintly decorated, which evidently had something traditionary in their embellishments, but about which, as I did not like to appear over curious, I asked no questions. I could not, however, but notice a pie, magnificently decorated with peacock feathers in imitation of the tail of that bird, which overshadowed a considerable tract of the table. This, the squire confessed with some little hesitation, was a pheasant pie, though the peacock pie was certainly the most authentic. But there had been such a mortality among the peacocks this season that he could not prevail upon himself to have one killed. It would be tedious, perhaps, to my wiser listeners, who may not have that foolish fondness of old and obsolete things to which I am a little given, were I to mention other makeshifts of this worthy old household by which they endeavored to follow up, though at a humble distance, the great customs of antiquity. I was pleased, however, to see the respect shown to his whims by his children and relatives, who indeed entered readily into the full spirit of them, and seemed all well versed in their parts, having been doubtless present at many a rehearsal. I was amused too with the air of profundity and gravity with which the butler and the other servants executed their duties assigned them, however eccentric. They had an old-fashioned look, having for the most part been brought up in the household and grown into keeping with the antiquated mansion and the humors of its lord, and most probably looked upon all his whimsical regulations as the established laws of honorable housekeeping. When the cloth was removed, the butler brought in a huge silver vessel of rare and curious workmanship, which he placed before the squire. Its appearance was hailed with acclamation, being the wassail bowl, so renowned in Christmas festivities. The contents had been prepared by the squire himself, for there was a beverage in the skillful mixture of which he particularly prided himself, alleging that it was too abstruse and too complex for the comprehension of an ordinary servant. There was a potation, indeed, which might well make the heart of a toper leap within him, being composed of the richest and raciest wines, highly spiced and sweetened with roasted apples bobbing about the surface. The old gentleman's whole countenance beamed with a serene look of indwelling delight as he stirred this mighty bowl. Having raised it to his lips for a hearty wish of a Merry Christmas to all present, he sent it brimming round the board for everyone to follow his example according to the primitive style, pronouncing it, quote, the ancient fountain of good feeling where all hearts met together, unquote. There was much laughing and rallying as the honest emblem of Christmas hospitality circulated, and was kissed rather coyly by the ladies. When it reached Master Simon, he raised it in both hands, and with an air of a boon companion, struck up an old wassail song. This brown bowl, the merry brown bowl that goes round about her, fill still, let the world say what it will, and drink your fill all out of. The deep can, this deep merry can, which thou dost freely offer. Sing, fling, be merry as a king, and sound a lusty laugher. Much of the conversation during dinner turned to family topics, to which I was a stranger. There was, however, a great deal of rallying and poking it of Master Simon about some gay widow with whom he was accused of having a flirtation. This attack was commenced by the ladies, but it continued throughout the dinner by the fat-headed old gentleman next to the parson. At every pause of the general conversation, he renewed his bantering in pretty much the same terms, winking hard at me with both eyes whenever he gave Master Simon what he considered a home thrust. The latter, indeed, seemed fond of being teased on the subject, as old bachelors were apt to be, and he took occasion to inform me, in an undertone, that the lady in question was a prodigiously fine woman who drove her own carriage. The dinner time passed away in this flow of innocent hilarity, and though the hall may have resounded at its times with many a scene of broader rout and revel, yet I doubt it ever witnessed more honest and genuine enjoyment. It is easy for one benevolent being to diffuse pleasure about him, and how truly is a kind heart a fountain of gladness, making everything in its vicinity to freshen into smiles. The joyous disposition of the worthy squire was perfectly contagious. He was happy himself and disposed to make the whole world happy. And the little eccentricities of his humor did but season, in a manner, the sweetness of his philanthropy. When the ladies had retired, the conversation, as usual, grew still more animated, and many good things were broached that had been thought of during dinner, but which would not have been appropriate for a lady's ear. And though I cannot positively affirm that there was much wit uttered, yet I have certainly heard many contests of rare wit produce much less laughter. Wit, after all, is a mighty, pungent, tart ingredient, and much too acid for some stomachs. But honest, good humor is the oil and wine of a merry meeting, and there is no jovial companionship equal to that where the jokes are rather small and the laughter abundant. The squire told several long stories of early college pranks and adventures, in some of which the parson had been a sharer, though in looking at the latter, required some effort of imagination to imagine such a dark little anatomy of a man into the perpetrator of a madcap gamble. Still, there seemed to be a spark of almost extinguished fire, feebly glimmering in the bottom of his soul. And as the squire hinted at a sly story of the parson and the pretty milkmaid whom they once met upon the banks of the river, the old gentleman made such an alphabet of faces, which, as far as I could decipher, I verily believe was indicative of laughter. Indeed, I have rarely met with an old gentleman who took absolutely offense to the imputed gallantries of his youth. I found the tide of wine and wassail fast gaining on the dry land of sober judgment. The company grew merrier and louder as their jokes grew duller. Master Simon was in as chirping a humor as a grasshopper filled with dew. His old songs grew of a warmer complexion, and he began to talk maudlin about the widow. He even gave a long song about the wooing of a widow, which he informed me he had gathered from an excellent black letter book entitled Cupid's Solicitor for Love, which contained a good store of advice for bachelors, which he promised to lend me. The song inspired the fat-headed old gentleman who made several attempts to tell a rather broad story out of Joe Miller that was pat to the purpose, but he always got stuck in the middle, everybody recollecting the latter part, excepting himself. The parson, too, began to show the effects of good cheer, and having gradually settled down into a doze, his wig sitting at most suspiciously on one side. Just at this juncture, we were summoned to the drawing room, and as I suspect, at the private instigation of mine host, whose joviality seemed always tempered with a proper love of decorum. After the table was removed, the hall was given up to the younger members of the family, who prompted to all kinds of noisy mirth by the Oxonian and Master Simon, made its old balls ring with their merriment as they played at romping games. I'm particularly delighted in witnessing the gambols of children, and particularly at this happy holiday season, and could not help stealing out of the drawing room upon hearing some of their peals of laughter. I found them at a game of blind man's bluff. Master Simon, who was the leader of their revels, and seemed on all occasions to fill the office of that ancient potentate, the lord of misrule, was blindfolded in the midst of the hall. The little beings were as busy about him as the mock fairies around Falstaff, pinching him, plucking at the skirts of his coat, tickling him with straws. One fine blue-eyed girl of about 13, with her flaxen hair all in beautiful confusion, her frolic face in a glow, her frock half torn off her shoulder, a complete picture of a romp, was the chief tormentor. And from the slyness with which Master Simon avoided the smaller game and hemmed this wild little nymph in corners and obliged her to jump shrieking over chairs, I suspect the rogue of not being one whit more blinded than was convenient. When I returned to the drawing room, I found the company seated around the fire, listening to the parson. He was deeply ensconced in a high-backed oaken chair, the work of some cunning craftsman of yore, which had been brought from the library for his particular accommodation. From this general piece of furniture, with which his shadowy figure and dark weazened face so admirably accorded, he was dealing forth strange accounts of the popular superstitions and legends of the surrounding country, with which he had become acquainted in the course of all of his antiquarian researches. I am half inclined to think that the old gentleman was himself somewhat tinctured with superstition, as men are very apt to be who live in a reclusive and studious life in a sequestered part of the country and pore over black letter tracts so often filled with the marvelous and superstitious. He gave us several anecdotes of fancies of the neighborhood peasantry concerning the effigy of the crusader which lay on the tomb by the church altar. It was the only monument of the kind in this part of the country, and had always been regarded with feelings of superstition by the good wives of the village. It was said to get up from the tomb and walk the rounds of the churchyard in stormy nights, particularly when it thundered. And one old woman, whose cottage bordered on the churchyard, had seen it through the windows of the church when the moon shone, slowly pacing up and down the aisles. These tales were often laughed at by some of the sturdier of the rustics, yet when night came on, there were many of the stoutest unbelievers who were shy of venturing alone in the footpath that led across the churchyard. From these and other anecdotes that followed, the crusader appeared to be the favorite hero of ghost stories throughout the vicinity. His picture, which hung up in the hall, was thought by the servants to have something supernatural about it, for they remarked that in whatever part of the hall you went, the eyes of the warrior were fixed upon you. The old porter's wife at the lodge, who had been born and brought up in the family, and was a great gossip among the maidservants, affirmed that in her younger days she had often heard say that on Midsummer's Eve, when it was well known that all kinds of ghosts and goblins and fairies became visible and walk abroad, the crusader used to mount his horse, come down from his picture, ride about the house, down the avenue, and so to the church to visit his tomb. On which occasions the church door most civilly swung open of itself. Not that he needed it, for he rode through closed gates and even stone walls, and had been seen by one of the dairymaids to pass between two bars of the great park gate, making himself as thin as a sheet of paper. All these superstitions, I found, had been very much countenanced by the squire, who, though not being superstitious himself, was very fond of seeing others so. He listened to every goblin tale of the neighborhood gossips with infinite gravity, and held the porter's wife in high favor on account of her talent for the marvelous. He was himself a great reader of old legends and romances, and often lamented that he could not believe in them. For a superstitious person, he thought, must live in a kind of fairyland. Whilst we're all attention to the person's ears, his stories, our ears were suddenly assailed by a burst of sounds from the hall, in which were, were mingled something like the clang of rude minstrelsy with the uproar of many small voices and girlish laughter. The door suddenly flew open, and a train came trooping into the room. That might almost have been mistaken for the breaking up of the court of fairy. That indefatigable spirit, Master Simon, in the faithful discharge of his duties as Lord of Misrule, had conceived the idea of a Christmas mummery or masking, and having called into his assistance the Oxonian and the young officer, who were equally ripe for anything that would occasion romping and merriment, they had carried it into instant effect. The old housemaid had been consulted, antiques, clothes presses, and wardrobes rummaged, and made to yield up the relics of finery that had not seen the light for many generations. For the younger part of the company had been convened from the parlor and the hall, and the whole had been decked out into a burlesque imitation of an antique mask. Master Simon led the van as Ancient Christmas, quaintly apparelled in a short cloak, which had every much the aspect of being one of the old housekeeper's petticoats, and a hat that might have served as for a church steeple. From under this, his nose curled boldly forth, flushed with a frostbitten bloom that seemed the very trophy of a December blast. He was accompanied by the blue-eyed romp, dished up as Dame Mince Pie, in the venerable magnificence of faded brocade, a long stomacher, peaked hat, and high-heeled shoes. The young officer appeared as Robin Hood, in a sporting dress of Kendrell green and a foraging cap with a gold tassel. The costume, to be sure, did not bear testimony to deep research, and there was an evident eye to the picturesque, natural to a young gallant in the presence of his mistress. The fair Julia hung on his arm in a pretty rustic dress as Maid Marian. The rest of the train had been metamorphosed in various ways. The girls trussed up in the finery of the ancient belles of the Bracebridge line, the stiplings bewhiskered with burnt cork, and gravely clad in broad skirts, hanging sleeves, and full-bottomed wigs, to represent the characters of roast beef, plum pudding, and other worthies celebrated in ancient maskings. The whole was under the control of the Oxonian in the appropriate character of misrule. And I observed that he exercised rather a mischievous way of waving his wand over the small personages of the pageant. The eruption of this motley crew, with beat of drum, according to the ancient custom, was the consummation of uproar and merriment. Master Simon covered himself in glory by the stateliness with which, as ancient Christmas, he danced a minuet with the peerless, though giggling, Dame Mince Pie. It was followed by a dance of all the characters, which, from its medley of costumes, seemed as if though the old family portraits had skipped down from their frames to join in the sport. Different centuries were figuring across hands and left and right. The dark ages were cutting pirouettes and rigadoons, and the days of Queen Bess jigging merrily down the middle, through a line of succeeding generations. The worthy squire contemplated these fantastic sports and the resurrection of his old wardrobe with the simple relish of childish delight. He stood chuckling and rubbing his hands, and scarcely hearing a word what the parson said, notwithstanding that the latter was discoursing most authentically on the ancient and stately dance of the paycock, from which he conceived the minuet was to be derived. For myself, I was in a continual excitement from the varied scenes of whimsy and innocent gaiety passing before me. It was inspiring to see wild-eyed frolic and heart-warmed hospitality breaking out from among the chills and gloom of winter, and old age throwing off his apathy and catching once more the freshness of youthful enjoyment. I felt also an interest in the scene from the consideration that these fleeting customs were posting fast into oblivion, and that this was perhaps the only family in England in which the whole of them were still scrupulously observed. There was a quaintness, too, mingled with all this revelry that gave it a particular zest. It was suited to the time and place, and as the old manor house almost reeled with mirth and wassail, it seemed to be echoing back the joviality of departed years. But enough of Christmas and its gambols. It is time for me to pause in this. Methinks I hear the questions raised by my graver listeners. To what purpose is all this? How is the world made wiser by this talk? Alas, is there not wisdom enough extant for the instruction of the world? And if not, are there not thousands of abler pens laboring in its improvement? It is so much more pleasant to please than to instruct, play the companion rather than the teacher. What, after all, is the mite of wisdom that I could throw into the mass of knowledge? Or how am I sure that my sagest deductions may be safe guides for the opinions of others? But in writing to amuse, if I fail, the only evil is my own disappointment. If, however, I can by any lucky chance in these days of evil rub out one wrinkle from the brow of care, or beguile the heavy heart of one moment of sorrow, if I can now and then penetrate through the gathering film of misanthropy, prompt a benevolent view of human nature, and make my reader more in good humor with his fellow beings and himself, surely I have not then written or spoken entirely in vain. Now you've noticed no Christmas tree, no gifts except for the children or gifts of food brought as a gift. And no St. Nicholas, no Father Christmas, Santa Claus. Which is sort of interesting when Irving was one of the people who really started us with the idea of St. Nicholas and Santa Claus with his Knickerbocker History of New York, published on St. Nicholas Day in 1809. Oh, maybe I hope I don't disappoint anybody, but Bracebridge Hall is fiction. Irving saw a few of these customs in his travels in England, but most of it he got from reading in the British Museum and from talking to the older folk. It was always a great one for talking to older ladies for stories and tales. So what he did was compile it all and put it together. He gave us Bracebridge Hall and Old Christmas. His American readers were saying, oh, this is how the British celebrate Christmas. We should do this. What they didn't know is his British readers were saying, oh, this is how our ancestors did it. We should revive some of this. Irving had a good laugh over it all. And years later, in the 1840s, he was our ambassador to Spain. He was invited for the Christmas season to the House of Friends in England, where he was promised an old-fashioned Christmas served up in the proper style. Well, Irving accepted the invitation, and in the course of the festivities, realized that these people learned all their ancient traditions from reading the sketchbook. Irving said that he always liked to be either pleased or amused. In this case, he was both. He accepted it all as the family's ancient custom, knowing that they got it all from him. Now, Thursday night, it is the Christmas Carol. If you've been listening and paying attention, you're going to be saying, where did I hear this before? Where did Dickens get this from? I'll tell you where he got it from. He was a great fan of Washington Irving's. They had a correspondence. They met when Dickens came to America. In fact, at a banquet in his honor, Irving gave an introductory speech, and Dickens applauded Irving, saying, Washington Irving, there's not 2 nights out of 7 I do not go up to bed without a volume of Washington Irving under my arm. The influence will show. Oh, for local viewers, PBS has a program on this coming Sunday at 8. The 12 days of Tudor Christmas, where you actually see some of these things done, including a boar's head, which I have to admit is a little odd. So, on behalf of Washington Irving, Marshmont Public Library, and myself, I wish you the best of holidays, a Happy New Year, and if there are any of these traditions that you're interested in, come to the library. I think we can find you some information. Thank you for listening. So, let us see.